Hello and welcome to This Week in X. This is the show where I get to tell you all about the new X-Men titles out from Marvel Comics. This week, on Wednesday, March 14th, there were 6 new X-Men titles out from Marvel, so we have a lot to talk about. I'll help you get caught up with what's happening in each series and give you a little bit of a review to let you know if they're worth your time reading. The 6 series this week include All New Wolverine, number 32, Astonishing X-Men, number 9, New Mutants Dead Souls, number 1 of 5, Old Man Logan, number 36, Weapon X, number 15, and finally, X-Men Blue, number 23. So let's dig in. First up this week is All New Wolverine, issue number 32. All New Wolverine, issue number 32, is written by Tom Taylor, with art from Jabril Morissette-Fan, color art from Nolan Woodard, letters by Corey Petit, and a main cover by David Lopez. The first thing you need to know is that All New Wolverine is X-23, Lara. She took on the mantle of Wolverine after Logan's death, and she's really trying to prove herself as a major hero who can follow in his footsteps, and just like he did, kind of suppress her rage and her past as a killer, which is really relevant for this issue. So to really understand what's going on here, you need to have read probably 2 things. One of which is some of X-23's early exploits, where we really see her as being kind of owned and controlled by the modern version of the Weapon X program and triggered by this trigger scent that causes her to just fly into a rage and do whatever killing deeds they insist that she does. And so if you've read her original miniseries or the Target X miniseries, that would be really good background here. And the other thing is the recently concluded Orphans of X arc. So this featured characters that were the survivors of family members who had been killed not just by X-Men or mutants, but specifically by X-23 and some of the other Weapon X derived mutants. And it was a really great arc. You can see it in my earlier This Week in X videos that I was a big fan of it, and I highly recommend it. So if you've read those things, I think you're ready for this issue. If you haven't, it's still a good one-shot issue, but it's gonna feel like it was all kind of invented on the spot, which is fine. Sometimes that's the case in comic stories. It's just not gonna have the level of connection to her past that it could have. And I actually really like that about this issue, that it was reverent in talking about Lara's past, but it didn't mean you had to have a complete memorization of all of those comics. I haven't read them for 5 or 6 years, but I knew exactly what it was referring to in terms of her origins. So the other thing to say about this issue is that the artwork, it's a little bit different than what we've seen in All New Wolverine recently. The last issue in that Orphans of X arc, it had a very high gloss sort of look, just really like bold, really well illustrated, well rendered characters. This is like a little bit stepped back from that. It's not as shiny, it still really works for me. I think part of that is because it has the same colorist, and there's a fantastic colorist, his name is Nolan Woodard, and he's become one of my favorites at Marvel, but also because it makes sense that this arc was just not as bright. It's just a single story and it's meant to be a little bit gritty. There was one hesitation I had with it, which I think the story in Tom Taylor's script pandered a little bit hard. And it was pandering to me, so I should like appreciate that, right? Like, yes, thank you for pandering. But it kind of turns this story of gaining revenge on one of the people who used to steer X-23's actions, and so effectively one of the men who orphaned one of the orphans of X through his actions. It kind of views that through a present-day film of combating white supremacy and Nazism. And look, I'm all about combating those two things. They make a comment on this issue, let's put on our Nazi stomping boots. I would love to see a lot more Marvel characters put on some Nazi stomping boots. I'm totally pro that. But it just feels like at points it got to be like very winking, like it was like, hey, this person we're hunting down, we're gonna kick his Nazi butt, wink, wink, wink. And it just got to be like a little bit much for me. I think the story was probably good enough to stand on its own, and when things wink so hard at current events, even if they're incredibly relevant social current events, I just feel like they don't always age well. Like, this might be a really delightful issue to read right now, but is it going to be delightful to read in like 4 or 5 years? I hope not, because I hope that this is not going to be as present in the conversation. So it's a minor nitpick, but I do know that's the kind of thing that takes people out of comics sometimes, and so I want to put it out there. But I think what the issue does well is it shows us that X-23, Lara, Wolverine, whatever you want to call her, she's at the end of her journey of turning from a killing machine to a really fully nuanced human being who has regret, who feels remorse, and who can make decisions in the heat of the moment instead of always turning to violence and rage. And so I think that's successful. After this, Tom Taylor's going to take this book to a future Wolverine book for one arc that's kind of like Old Woman Laura or something. It's going to mirror Old Man Logan, but I think in a more positive sense. Personally, I mean, I'll keep reviewing it, but I'm not as excited for that as knowing that they are going to be relaunching X-23 later this year with the artist from that Orphans of X arc, Wonka Ball. So I'm pretty excited about that, although there is some fan dissent about the book being called X-23, because hasn't she like put that behind her now? Well, I guess we're going to find out. But if you just want to read this issue and then kind of stop, I don't think you're going to need to read the next arc to get ready to pick up that X-23 book that starts in a few months. Next up this week, we have Astonishing X-Men issue number 9. Astonishing X-Men issue number 9 was written by Charles Soule, with art from Matteo Bufagni, color art from Giada Marchesio, letters by Clayton Cowles, and a cover by Lionel Francis Yu with Maury Hollowell. This continues the 12-issue maxi series of Astonishing X-Men. Maxi series just means it's a limited series that's a little bit longer and has an end in sight, by the way. Somebody asked that last time. And we're almost at the end. We're in the middle of the second arc, and I think that it's having a similar problem to what was happening in the middle of the first arc, which is that it's starting to feel like the things that are happening in these issues are kind of unnecessary. So when I reviewed the last issue of this, I talked a lot about that it felt like a big 90s comic more than it felt like some sort of premiere special prestige maxi series, and I stand by that. This is a big, fun, bash 'em up 90s version of X-Men. It's got a couple of big ideas, but it's really just puts glossy characters on the page and it has them do interesting stuff. Here's the thing. One of the things that opens this issue is that at the end of last issue, Proteus left X, this version of Professor Xavier that we have in this story, and Psylocke kind of psychically tangled, and Proteus can alter reality, and so their psychic entanglement was reflected in a physical entanglement in the real world. And at least a third of this issue, if not half, is really focused on getting the two of them untangled. Now, this is the kind of plot that I can absolutely picture happening in a 90s X-Men comic book. Like, I feel like it can almost like go into my long boxes that I still have of comics and pluck it out of the box. But the thing here is that it doesn't feel like there's any real risk. We never really believe that either of them is going to die. We never really believe that either of them is at risk of any kind of pain or significant transformation from this. It just kind of just feels like it's playing out pages in the comic, and it's not even that interesting. So, like, my criteria for a comic being good is, you know, is it well crafted, but also, like, are there risks to these characters? Are these characters fundamentally changing? Are we seeing an interesting moment that's memorable for them? And it just doesn't really feel like this fits any of the criteria. Also, we get Proteus, who's now escaped the X-Men because of them dealing with the situation, and he's setting up a truly interesting kind of a conflict for them to walk into in the next issue. I was trying to picture what other X-Men villain could really make something like this work, and I don't know if anybody other than Legion really could. And, you know, there are parallels between Legion and Proteus. Legion being Professor X's son and Proteus being Moira McTaggart's son. So I like that part of it. But again, it just feels like it's a lot of like really lengthy setup for something that could have been paid off in a panel. So, and that to me is decompression that doesn't feel like 90s X-Men. 90s X-Men, every issue is like, even if you read and it almost seems like they tried to shock you so many times that like you just wore out of being shocked because everything was shocking. That was the style in the early 90s. And I feel like this series is like teasing that, but then it keeps getting wrapped up in this this modern version of decompression where it's like, well, we need a 6-issue story, we better tease it out to a full arc. So like, I really am having trouble recommending this title. I keep feeling like I'm on a seesaw every couple of issues. Like the first issue was amazing and then it kind of fell off. And then issues 7 and 9 were amazing, or 7 and 8 were amazing, then I don't really like issue 9. I think if you like big fun X-Men stories, and you don't really want to get invested in like what's happening with mutants right now, then this is the series to be picking up because it's really not tied into a larger plot. It's like one specific adventure that's going to have 1 or 2 big outcomes for the X-Men, but it's not like X-Men Gold or Blue that's part of an ongoing saga. Next up this week is a new New Mutants miniseries. It's called New Mutants Dead Souls, and this is the first of 5 issues. New Mutants Dead Souls is written by Matthew Rosenberg, with art from Adam Gorham, colors from Michael Garland, and letters from Clayton Cowles. The cover is by Ryan Stegman and Michael Garland. How to catch you up with New Mutants. Well, first of all, this book was clearly supposed to come out to accompany the New Mutants movie, which got pushed back 10 months, but Marvel already had the series in the can, so they just went with it. You don't need to know a lot about classic New Mutants to enjoy this book for a couple of different reasons. First of all, it draws from many different periods of the original 100-issue New Mutants series. We have had 2 additional New Mutants ongoing volumes since then, but both of them were very referential to that original 100-issue issue series. It's not like X-Force, where like every incarnation has been a little bit different. And this New Mutants cast draws from all points of that series. It has some characters from the very first graphic novel in the first issue, and characters from the very end of the series as well. So I actually really like that. It felt like a greatest hits of New Mutants, and it didn't feel like I was picking them up from like some specific point. But then the other thing that makes it really easy to pick up is just Matthew Rosenberg's script makes all these characters really fun. It introduces them and gives them a singular moment, and it doesn't really rely on any recent history of any one of the characters on the team. The one recent history thing it does kind of rely on is this history of Karma, who's one of the original New Mutants, and the Hatchie Corporation. This played out in Marjorie Liu's run on Astonishing X-Men that started, I believe, with issue 50 and went through the end of Astonishing X-Men. But it's really that first arc that has North Star's wedding in it that sets up the story that gets continued here. The thing you do need to know is that Karma ultimately takes over this big multinational kind of technology and manufacturing company. And in the scope of this issue, she has a group of her former teammates, although she wasn't on a team with all of them all at once, investigating some things that are happening to one of the outposts of her company that have a little bit of a horrific vibe to them. And this team is a really interesting team. So it has Magic at the forefront. Magic has really broken out. Ilyana Rasputin has really broken out as a major X-Men character ever since really she came back just prior to Second Coming. And then after Second Coming, she got upgraded to being a member of like the main X-Men squad. And she's been really in the focus of X-Men ever since then. So she actually has this like brand awareness to her that's not just from people who remember her from the 80s, which is how it used to be. So she's leading up this team, and the team has two classic choices that tie into X Factor, which is Rain, Wolfsbane, and also Strong Guy. And those two characters, Rain was from the very beginning of New Mutants. Strong Guy was actually first introduced in New Mutants, although he goes on to be a member of X Factor and Peter David's original 1991 run, and then again in 2006, which also includes Wolfsbane. So there's that unit of characters. And then there's also another unit of characters, Boom Boom and Richter. Now, Richter kind of crosses over between the two because Richter was a member of New Mutants, although he came in much later in the series, and he goes on to Cable's X-Force team in the 90s. But Richter was also used at length in the Peter David 2006 X-Factor series, so he has a connection to those other two characters as well. Boom Boom has sort of been on her own path. She also was somebody who came into New Mutants relatively late in the game. She went on to be a staple of X-Force, really like one of the core characters you wind up expecting to show up in an X-Force run, and less so with any kind of redos of New Mutants. She's also been in Warren Ellis's Next Wave, and she's a character that hasn't had a lot of character development. She tends to just make appearances and be fun. She almost has like a Harley Quinn quality to her, honestly, in current comic books. So this is a fun mix and match team. They have interesting ways to bump up against each other, and that's not the only New Mutants characters we see in this issue, but I won't spoil who the other one or two are. So I really think they bump up against each other well. They're all introduced well. Their powers make sense. And I've heard from and spoken to a couple people who have not been keeping up with X-Men as much as I have, and they all kind of got it. Like, this issue really landed for them. I think it's a great issue, not only for that reason, but because you'll hear me complain a lot that the X-Men has just become so rote, like hated, feared, time travel, alternate futures, like cloning, like it just seems like it hits the same 4 or 5 beats over and over again, and some of them are beats that don't even feel core to the X-Men, like this time travel stuff. That's not what mutants are about. That's just like one particular wing of the X-Men stories that we just can't get rid of. And so far, at least in this first issue, this is none of that. This is just X-Men doing interesting X-Men things that they can do as mutants that doesn't have to do with any of that. And it has a cast of characters that have been massively, massively underexposed recently, and that really makes me love it. Now, Matthew Rosenberg is an amazing writer. I've loved his independent stuff, especially 4K's Walk into a Bank, which I think is a perfect comic book. I didn't really love his Phoenix Resurrection, as you saw in earlier issues of this video series, where I kind of started out in it strong, and by the end I was like, what is the point? I'm really hoping that's not going to be the case here, but I have to be a little bit cautious in my optimism in this first issue, because it's the same thing. It's a 5-issue series, and the first issue of Phoenix Resurrection was also really intriguing. So I'm kind of like, oh, this is really intriguing, but do I trust Matthew Rosenberg to really deliver across all 5 of these issues? I think it's a potential watershed moment for him because it's his kind of second turn it back with this mutant franchise. He's also going to be writing a Madrox the Multiple Man series, and we want to know that he's somebody we really can trust with these characters. So I want him to see him do really well, and I want this series to maintain the quality it's got right here. This is absolutely recommended. Whether you have fond memories of the New Mutants or not, this is an X-Men title you can pick up from issue number 1 and immediately have fun. But if you know a lot about these characters, it's even more satisfying. Next up this week is Old Man Logan issue number 36. Old Man Logan issue number 36 was written by Ed Brisson with art from Dalibor Talajic, color art from Carlos Lopez, letters from Cory Petit, and a cover by Mike Deodato Jr. and Carlos Lopez. This issue of Old Man Logan continues this period of adventures for the old version of Wolverine that seems like it comes after a lot of the other X-Men stories that are happening right now, because his healing factor is very weak, and he has one hand that has bone claws, and so we haven't seen that in some of the other issues, and this seems like it's kind of driving him through a sequence of events that might see him come to his end, because we know we're getting the real Logan back in just a matter of months. He's already started popping up in some titles, including the Infinity Countdown, which has been excellent. So the other thing, though, is that this issue starts out with a revelation, and it's an interesting revelation that I think was very affecting for this character. One of the premises of this series was that Old Man Logan returns to the past, and he realizes this is not his past. It's not part of the future that we see him in the original Old Man Logan story that's very similar to the future we see him in the Logan movie, which is this kind of like post-apocalyptic future where all of the X-Men and most of the heroes are dead. And in the comic book, he's responsible for killing them, a lot of them, because Mysterio convinces him that the X-Men are villains and he kills a lot of them. And so he's kind of taken solace in the fact that he's in this like branched version of the past, and all he can do really is try to create good in this branched version of the past, because it's not going to turn into his future, which he would of course want to avert. But at the beginning of this issue, he has this realization that maybe our present is steering back to his future. And I think that's so powerful. Usually with time travel, it's all about like avert the future or make sure the future happens, but it seems like this very binary, like either it's working or it's not working. I don't feel like time travel stories, in Marvel at least, tend to like bend around to be like, if you're not careful, this could wind up being your future anyway. And he certainly hasn't been suspecting that. But in seeing that Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin, has been elected the mayor of New York, which has been happening in Daredevil recently, Old Man Logan comes to this realization of like, oh my god, like what if it is my future? What if I really need to do something to intervene instead of just being this old weary person wandering the modern world, which is where this series has been to this date. So that's a really interesting first part, and I was like, wow, this is going to be intense. And then it kind of just turns into like a MacGuffin hunt, like somebody's got some information and then they don't, like, okay. I think it was decently made, but it just had a very kind of like ho-hum quality to it that really didn't make me feel like, oh, I've got to read this issue. Now, who knows? Maybe what Wolverine does with this information that puts him in conflict with Wilson Fisk is going to be really interesting in the issues to come, and that certainly might be the case. And I would love it if this series kind of bends back around to address what was going on in the opening frames of this issue, which is this idea of that he's really trying to cultivate a future that will never produce him, which is, I think, one of the few time travel stories that I tend to get really invested in, because it's about somebody being watchful and mindful of what's happening in the current day. And we see that as a theme frequently with Rachel Summers, and I think that it's also an effective theme for her. So, I'm going to keep picking this up. I think we're probably near the end at this point, and I do think the last 2 arcs have been 2 of the best arcs so far in this series, so Ed Brisson does have a little bit of my trust at this point on Old Man Logan. The next issue also features Old Man Logan pretty heavily, and I think there's an argument to be made that this should have been an Old Man Logan issue. It's not, though. It's Weapon X issue number 15. Weapon X 15 was written by Greg Pak with his frequent co-writer Fred Van Lent, with artist Roland Boschi, colorist Frank Dermata, letters from Joe Caramagna, and a cover by Eric Kennett. There's this ongoing trope, it's not a trope, an ongoing story theme that we've seen a few times now, that Sabretooth tries to kill Wolverine on Wolverine's birthday. It's sort of a Sabretooth's twisted version of Wolverine's birthday gift. Now, Sabretooth has been a cast member in this Weapon X series, and that's because he's still somewhat flipped from the Axis event that occurred late in Marvel Now, where the Red Skull kind of flipped all the heroes to villains and all the villains to heroes. At the end of that event, a couple of people didn't flip back, and Sabretooth was one of them. So, but it's kind of been fading away, so Cullen Bunn put him to really great use in Uncanny X-Men at the beginning of All New, All Different Marvel, and we see Sabretooth like still having good impulses, but realizing that that old violence is there. So it's not a all-at-once flip back, it's kind of he's gradually turning. And I love this issue because I got the sense that like this reoccurrence of this old habit of like fighting Wolverine and trying to kill him every year on his birthday kind of made Sabretooth snap all the way. Like we've been seeing it throughout the series and especially in the last arc that he's getting more and more bloodthirsty and he can't really be trusted. And at the beginning of this story, Old Man Logan, who's the Wolverine that's on this team, kind of says like, we've got to find another mission because I need something to keep Sabretooth occupied before he gets a thirst for blood. And it turns out that he was absolutely right. And like this fight, it feels nasty, it feels brutal, it feels motivated, and it just feels like a great issue-long fight scene. If anything, I kind of wished that as a part of the recent convention of Marvel, like actually exploring where the past continuity that served a current story emerged from, I wish that we had gotten like an annotated page to show us what issues these other fights have taken part in, because I know I can remember at least a couple of them, but I don't remember all the places that they've been. Marvel has done that recently. They did it this week in Avengers No Surrender, where they annotated a lot of interesting points from the story with what issues they were drawn from. They did it last week in Infinity Countdown, or maybe that was a couple of weeks ago, but to show like where all of the Infinity Stones gems had kind of been through their past story. So that would have been fun here. But ultimately, this feels just like a very core story about Old Man Logan and Sabretooth, and that like some things never change. And in the course of the fight, Old Man Logan is kind of remembering that he had to kill all of the X-Men, you know, in the future, as we were just talking about. And Sabretooth is like, oh, I bet the one that you thought was me was one that you really enjoyed killing. But there's kind of, I thought, this unspoken moment of like, Sabretooth could be an X-Men though. Like we've been asked to trust him so many times, so there is maybe some inherent conflict in that, even though Wolverine's been forced to kill him many times to date. So I just thought that this was like strangely complex, much more complex than I thought it was going to be. And also, I really did wind up enjoying the art. You know, I sometimes think that Roland Boschi has like a little bit of flatness to his perspectives. Like his characters look like a 2D face that's just been rotated on a plane a little bit, and you can kind of like see the edge of it. And maybe that's a coloring issue. I really don't know because I haven't seen a lot of his pencil art or black and white art, but everything here feels pretty full and it feels pretty bloody and brutal, and I really enjoyed it. So I was kind of down on the last Weapon X arc, and I do think this book is suffering from like, why does it exist? But I think Wolverine puts words to that in this issue. Like if the team doesn't exist for a reason, they're all going to trickle away and do something else, and I have to hold them together. And so that actually winds up being a pretty interesting issue here, and it brings the story back to the start because they wind up somewhere that has to do with some of the earlier stories we've seen in this title. So it feels like maybe this arc could be wrapping it up, especially again with the hint that we might be almost done with Old Man Logan. His primary titles might be winding down at this point, although I'm not sure that I've seen cancellation news on this one. Our last issue this week is X-Men Blue issue number 23. X-Men Blue number 23 was written by Cullen Bunn with art from George Molina, color art from Matt Milla with J. David Ramos, and letters from Joe Caramagno. The cover is by George Molina. You've heard me talk a lot of trash about X-Men Blue and the original Teen X-Men and like blah, 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 right? They're not in this issue. Even though it's their book, this issue is happening while they're in space in the Poison X arc. And no spoilers here when I say this is one of the best and most interesting issues of an X-Men title we have had since Resurrection began almost a year ago. Why? Because it feels like we're playing in the big leagues of X-Men again. This issue has Polaris, it has Magneto, it has Havoc, it has Emma Frost, it has Sebastian Shaw. So it's got that classic feeling group of adult characters, but it also feels like there's machinations on top of machinations that they're trying to like outflank each other. This was a hallmark of Cullen Bunn's Magneto series in Marvel Now. If you've ever said to yourself like, I don't need to read a Magneto series, is it just him being like, mutants, mutants, in like every issue and like being like, to me, mutants. No, it's so morally gray. It's like a Magneto who kind of realizes that he's had the chance to be a hero over and over again, and he's had the chance to be a despotic ruler over and over again, and neither of them are working. So maybe he needs to take a slightly different approach to being Magneto if he wants to find success. It is phenomenal. No, I don't want to like overhype it, but I want to say that the amount of hype it gets doesn't even really do justice to what happens in the story, because it's not the kind of story you can hype. It's subtle. I think you should read it. And then Bunn continues that, but in a much less subtle, much more glossy way in Uncanny X-Men at the beginning of All New, All Different Marvel. And that was the series that also developed the Sabretooth story that I was just talking about. Great connection between all the books this week. So Magneto has been ostensibly one of the stars of this X-Men Blue series, and we get a little bit of his machinations early on, but he's really been at the fringe of the X-Men Blue story. And here that story has just been like put in the pocket and forgotten about as we really deal with what's happening with the mutant race. But also we get the alternate version of Wolverine's son, Jimmy Hudson, and the alternate version of Storm from the Mutant X universe. And they're on a little bit of a side mission, but here it just feels like they have a little bit more heft when they're not a part of these 5 carbon copies of the original X-Men plus the 2 of them. Ultimately, Jimmy Hudson and this version of Storm really have very different stories. They're not just kid versions of their adult X-Men, because there's no version of Wolverine's son other than really Doc, but he's not the same character, and this is a very, very, very different Storm. And so it even felt more satisfying to see them. It's not just about me not liking the original X-Men as teenagers, it's about this issue feeling like the X-Men comic books that I came back to comic books to read. So this is probably only part of a brief arc without the X-Men Blue. I'm sure they're going to be back into their title at some point, and maybe we'll even get a resolve of them traveling through time. But if you've been waiting to just pick up an X-Men title and you were reading X-Men at some point in that last 3 or 4 years where you read Magneto or you read Uncanny X-Men, I think you could pick up this issue and probably be pretty satisfied. I know I'm really satisfied. So kudos to Colin Bunn for kind of like refining the plot of this X-Men franchise. I would love to be reading an ongoing X-Men book that was a lot more like this, and I think this kind of seedy underbelly of what's going on in the X-Men is a wonderful contrast to the more positive approach that X-Men Red is trying to take, and then also X-Men Gold as a sort of pointless soap opera, right? So that's like 3 really good points of X-Men. I'll find a way to say nasty things about X-Men Gold even if we're not reviewing it, apparently. So I really appreciated this issue, and I would look forward to reading more of this arc in the coming weeks and months. That's it for this week. Next week's actually going to be one of the shortest episodes of This Week in X so far. There's only 2 new X-Men issues on the schedule. Cable number 155, which is going to be the start of a new arc for Cable, and a new issue of X-Men Gold with issue number 24. However, there are going to be some interesting X-Men collections out next week, so we'll be talking about those at all. And don't miss it, I'm doing the first pilot episode of a 7-week pilot of my epic X-Men reread, starting on this coming Monday, where we're going to be rereading some classic issues of X-Men, and we're not just going to start from the beginning and go all the way through. We're actually going to skip around to get kind of a epic collection version of the X-Men. So on Monday, we're doing X-Men 1 through 3 from 1991 by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee, 3 of the highest selling comic books in the history of modern comic books. So probably things that you have in your collection if you're an X-Men fan at all. I would love it if you stop by and participate in the discussion after watching the video. So check that out and be back next week to hear more about what's going on this week in X from Marvel Comics. Thanks so much for watching.